Many thanks for the introduction and the welcome. My name is Henrike Lähnemann, and
I'm Emma Huber.
And we've been teaching history of the book and digital humanities as a method option for master students in the Faculty of Medieval and Modern Languages. And we actually have two of the master students who just did the course with us last year and have now acted as, together with Mary Newman, who'll also be on camera soon, as graduate assistants on this. And how we came about to concentrate on this volume in the Queen's College Library is that we have started in 2016 to run a series of editions of special collections in libraries around Oxford, particularly in the Taylor Institution Library, which is the Library for Modern Languages, focusing on the Reformation, because 2017 was the quincentenary of Martin Luther's publishing the 95 Thesis. And the three elements we had been focusing on was how to get the word out, and namely by printing, translating, and singing the Reformation. And one volume that incorporates all three aspects is the volume we have been focusing on for this project, namely a Sammelband, a collective volume of several pamphlets. And the challenge we put to the interns was to pick a pamphlet from the volume and find creative ways of encoding it. So Emma was the person responsible for the coding part, and I was more for the history of the book part. And we took up also the challenge of teaching this remotely. So we moved actually to see we had the volume digitized. It's now on the Digital Bodleian website. Here you see the table of contents, but we also moved with cameras and laptops into the Queen's College Library and inspected the volume together with Jane Egan, who is the paper conservator for the colleges, and took us via smartphone through all the signs of early usage. So since we can't be in the Queen's College Library itself, we have assembled here in the old library of St. Edmund Hall, a neighboring college. But if you want, you can watch all the material that we amassed through the course on the History of the Book blog, where all the interns also have presented the project. So it's something to catch up on later. But now I hand over to Zeb for telling us how we actually taught the course.
So the interns projects have all been based in TEI compliant XML, working to encode the book that we've just seen. So what is XML? First of all, XML is a markup language akin to HTML, which includes the use of tags and attributes to provide machine-readable information about a given text. What is TEI in particular? TEI is a dialect of XML specifically designed for use in the digital humanities, containing elements and attributes appropriate for the kind of texts that we might want to mark up. Why this encoding is helpful? It allows readers who might not be familiar with principles of paleography to access a particular text by making it digital, and equally it enables computer-based analysis of text which otherwise wouldn't be accessible. Handing over now to Mary, who's going to tell us a little bit about the encoding that we had a look at as a group. Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary. I'm the other graduate assistant. I'm just going to talk through a little bit of our schedule. It was quite a tight turnaround to learn TEI, so we came up with kind of a curriculum together to do this. This was after the initial data week in which the interns learned R, then we took over with TEI. So kind of the basis and the cornerstone of learning TEI is Emma Huber's series on TEI that she did for the Taylorian. It's incredible. I very much recommend that everyone check it out, whether or not you're interested in TEI, just as a great intro to digitization. And then we came up with some other things. So we did Monday morning code-a-thons to kind of get us all in the mood, in which we randomly kind of chose a challenge for the interns to try and encode. This image suggests my favorite one, in which we asked the interns to encode Sebastian's vaccine card and to think about how to encode it both as a material object, but then also something that could be analyzed as part of a database later, and the trouble with representing it, which was really fun. Then we had often afternoon drop-ins or mini lectures on specific topics, such as how to encode damage. We had tutorials in the morning, and all the interns wrote blog posts, normally looking over the week of their project and what they did, just to kind of reflect on it. So again, I kind of encourage you to read through those if you're interested. They're really wonderful insight and reflection on the program. And now we'll pass over to the interns to tell you about their incredible projects.
Right, so I'm Robbie, and the first pamphlet that we'll be presenting is called An ABC for Children, which is a short Tudor pamphlet which is designed to teach children how to read and write. So just for a quick piece of context, around this time, only 20% of men and 10% of women were able to sign their own names. So the kind of audience for this sort of text is actually quite small. Most people don't know how to read and write. So I thought I'd start off by explaining the kind of the contents and the structure of the pamphlet. So it begins with the alphabet, which you can see in the second picture, and underlined are a couple of characters and strange letters that you might not recognize, and we'll come back to that later. After the author has kind of presented the alphabet, he then moves on to listing every single syllable that is possible to write in English. So the vast majority of this pamphlet is just a long list of gobbledygook with random letter combinations. He then, after having done that, author moves on to an explanation of English orthography, kind of explaining how sound and written word link together. And this includes one of my favorite passages in the pamphlet, which is the kind of the third image down, where the author finds the time to insult the French and say that they can't write properly in the middle of his small pamphlet for children. I think it gives a real insight into the kind of political attitudes of the time. The author then decides to kind of finish off and round off the pamphlet with a series of religious texts and moral texts giving life advice. And you can see there's some quite cheerful life advice, like in the first picture on this slide, telling the audience to think of death. There's quite a somber attitude, which perhaps reflects sort of the quite hard life in the Tudor period. Yeah. So for the next slide. So we thought it would be a good idea with this first pamphlet to explain some of the strange symbols that you might encounter when you read older texts. So the first one is called the R rotunda, which you can see in the word dread in the first sentence. This is a variation of the letter R, which is used after round letters like a capital D or the letter P or O. Partly it's used because it looks nice, and it also helps to save space, which is very important in this time period where paper is actually very expensive. So a couple of other strange letters is called the yog, which is used often in place of Z. And we also find the long S, which you can see in the second image down in one of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not desire thy neighbor's house. Again, this is also used to help save space because again, to save paper. You also find in these early texts that U and V, I and J, and I and Y are not distinguished like they are in modern English. So that's one thing to look out for. It can be quite confusing. Yeah. Next slide, please. So I also thought it would be good to cover some of the abbreviations that people like to use. This is kind of the Tudor form of text speak. So Full words are often reduced down to just a couple of letters, like with, that, or the, all being cut down. You also find the inclusion of the symbol here that looks like a number 7, but actually isn't. So its name is the Tironian note, and it comes originally from an abbreviation of the Latin word et, which means and you find in medieval and early modern writing across Europe, all languages tend to use this Tironian note to represent and. You can see it on this slide here in the Latin, in the second image. Again, it's another space-saving measure, but we should also note that this symbol is still used today in a few languages like modern Irish. Final abbreviation I thought it was worth covering here is called the macron, which is the funny little hat that you see on the vowels at the bottom of the slide. This is used to represent where a N or an M has been taken out of the text. And you can see, for example, in the first image, in the word written or in end, where the N has been dropped and then the little hat has been placed on top. Okay, next slide. So how do we actually turn this old pamphlet into code and put it on a website? So we use TEI for this, like Seb explained just before. This enables us to label all the different parts of the text, so marking different paragraphs, different lines. It also enables us to kind of mimic some of the decorative letters in the text, also to label switches in languages, mark where pages begin and end. And as you can see in the bottom image, you can even go so far as labeling individual syllables. And the reason I did this for my pamphlet is so that hopefully in the future, people will be able to extract the syllables as a data set and analyze what syllables were possible in the English of this time period. So next slide. So one of the key aims that we had for this pamphlet in particular was to make it more accessible to a modern audience, perhaps even school children. So I developed 2 different versions of the pamphlet, one that's very true to the original text and then one that has been modified to make it more accessible for a modern reader. So on the left is the version of the pamphlet that mimics the original book, and on the right is the more modern version. So as you can see, in the modern version, we've dropped all of the strange characters and abbreviations. We've also removed the line breaks to make it look like normal prose, and we've also gone through and added in lots of critical notes throughout the pamphlet, explaining difficult words or archaic language, and also making sure that all of the Latin has an English translation. And we hope that this kind of revised edition could even be used to help teach school children a little bit about the past and what education used to be like in the Tudor period. And with that, I think it's time to hand over to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Robbie. And yes, we have...
Yes, up next we have Will Hazelwood.
Hi everyone, can you hear me all right?
Perfect.
Cool. Yeah, so good morning everyone. Thank you, Robbie, and thank you to the group before. That was really interesting, the AI project. So my project was the second pamphlet to appear in the Saml Band. It's called The Book of the Pilgrimage of Man. It's a fascinating early 16th century Catholic verse text printed in London around 1508. So I'm a lit graduate, literature graduate, and my interest is principally in the kind of remnant and recusant Catholic cultures and their literary intersections around the kind of late 16th early 17th century. So this is kind of almost in provenance terms, this is kind of almost a century from my kind of chief research focus. But I thought this was a fascinating opportunity to kind of expand the parameters of my own literary and historical interests. So I'm going to talk in 3 parts very briefly in each. Firstly about the pamphlet itself, then a kind of brief overview of my own process in creating a digital edition, and then I'm going to end with a kind of reflection of what is potentially academically relevant, considering the pamphlet itself and its now digitized form. So about the pamphlet itself then, well, it's one of 8 16th century printed pamphlets that appear in the Sammelband, which itself was likely to have all been bound together during the 16th century itself. But material evidence certainly suggests that it was certainly rebound at some point during the 19th. So the pamphlet itself was printed in London in 1508. Various sources cite William Hendred, an Anglo-Danish clergyman and translator, as its author, although there is evidence to suggest that this potentially was produced in collaboration with Hendred or by an alternative hand altogether. On the edition that is on the edition that's on the Taylor Editions website, goes into slightly more detail about that potentially, as you can see here. So the contents of the pamphlet depicts a narrative of the kind of spiritual journey of mankind. We go right from prelapsarian Eden through to the birth of Christ, some fascinating cantos that depict St. Peter's first papacy, and so forth, using various kind of biblical, deuterocanonical, papal, historical references. So it's really rich in a historical and theological perspective. So I'm quite unfamiliar with medieval literature and paleography. So this was challenging from various perspectives, but I am quite familiar with Chaucer. So there was some interesting comparisons to be made and similarities found between some Chaucerian literature, some of the tales in that, particularly the Merchant's Tale, and some of the opening of in the Pilgrimage of Man in particular. So creating a digital edition then. So next slide, please. I think, yeah, there we go. So in paleography, I have very little experience. This was creating the transcription from the facsimile was probably the hardest part of this process for me. As Robbie's touched upon, there's various variations in characters that are particularly difficult, but I found as you quickly become familiar with them and you progress through the pamphlet, it becomes naturally a lot more clear. The problem is with the verse text, as with modern verse and poetry, various syntax and rhyme is manipulated, which kind of only problematizes the process a little bit more, as authors are kind of dubiously constructing lines of verse to kind of fit in with structure. So I think next slide, please. So this is just a kind of example of some of the, as Robbie's touched on, some of the different, next slide, please. Yeah, so some of the various unfamiliar characters that appear quite frequently throughout the text. There's an interesting intersection, I think, here between the materiality of the text and the encounter in the kind of verse. So naturally, the use of like Tironian notes and thorns are certainly disruptive for me in reading the verse. But there's kind of a balance to be made here between the authorship and the kind of print logistics. So that's definitely interesting there. So from the transcription, moving on to encoding, audience was my key consideration here. I was struck by the prosody of the piece initially, so I decided to create a fairly diplomatic edition, which transcribes with a fair degree of accuracy. I kind of didn't translate a lot of the words and left them as they were to kind of retain the metrical structure of the piece, but also use TEI to highlight various poetic devices that can then be machine read and encountered later in the edition. So finally, just a brief note on the kind of academic relevance of the research. It seems to be quite a rare pamphlet, but is extremely rich in its significance, canonically, poetically, and historically. Accessibility, naturally, with a digital edition is a key focus, and the text canonically has been suggested by a curious little 1857 edition as an inspiration to John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And as I've kind of touched upon, the verse shares various formal and thematic features with Chaucer. So historical relevance as well. This is perhaps where I would like to take the project next, I think, highlighting some of the biblical, the Catholic contexts that exist within the text. We're kind of right on the periphery here of the Reformation starting to take place, where I think we're about 9 years away from Luther nailing his 95 Theses in Wittenberg. So for Reformation studies, this is potentially a really useful resource. And there are various, few, but certainly some deviations that I've found from kind of orthodox Catholic teaching at the time, which would potentially be of significance to kind of theologians of the early 16th century. So yeah, that's about it. A super interesting project that I really enjoyed, and yeah, a thank you to Henrike, Emma, and our great tutors in Seb and Mary. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Will. Fantastic. On now to Kieran Fogarty.
Hello. Hi. Can you hear me, Seb? Is it all good? Great. Okay. So yeah, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Very, very excited to talk to you about this edition, which is entitled "The Pleasant, Plain, and Pithy Pathway Leading to a Virtuous and Honest Life, No Less Profitable and Delectable." So I picked this text for a few reasons. I think initially I was really drawn to these woodcuts on the title page, as you can see. Yeah, they're great, aren't they? I think secondly, upon sort of a cursory reading of the text, I found the sort of poetic qualities really quite exciting, and I was curious as to what encoding challenges that would bring. And finally, I was sort of I was very intrigued by the opportunity to get sort of quote unquote life advice from a mid 16th century scholar. So I think to begin, I'll just introduce the text briefly. So the text was written by Valentine Lee, which you can see from the VL on the title page there. And it appears to have been printed in and around 1552 by Nicholas Hill on behalf of John Case. It's generally in good condition. There's very little damage obscuring the text. I did, however, find good evidence that 2 pages were missing, but I didn't find this to detract too much from the text. So the content of the text is broadly divided into 2 sections, wherein 2 distinct dialogues occur. These dialogues are written to educate the reader about how to best live a life, and what actions or behaviors to avoid. And on the title page here, just to go back to these woodcuts, we can see I found them to be representative of the actual dialogues themselves. So the top one, you see a younger man looking to an older man, which is essentially what happens in the first text. There's a younger man asking for advice from an older man. And then in the bottom one, which is my favorite one, there is a woman depicted adorned with wings in a very angelic fashion, and she's surrounded by this very beautiful ornamental sort of decorative material. And of course, the topic of the second dialogue is something of a tragic love story, or I suppose a love story for one partner, not for the other, as we'll find out. Next slide, please. So just to begin with the text, it begins with a foreword, this little this cute poem from the author, which lays out his intentions and the rhyming pattern that we see throughout virtually the whole text, which the author is kind enough to tell us not to judge too harshly, because just because it rhymes doesn't mean it isn't full of wisdom. And then after this, he briefly goes into a dialogue, and then you enter into the first real dialogue on the next slide, please. So the first, as I mentioned, the first dialogue is between a young man and an old man. The young man, his name seems to be Nitnalev, which is very confusing, as we all found, but it seems to be an anagram of the author's name. So Nitnalev, he tells his story and he laments that he's prone to all manner of vices, such as idleness and drunkenness. And so he asks for advice, which the old man, he listens to his story for quite a while. And in great detail, he sort of gives the younger man the advice that he asked for, which I can, there it is, thanks Henrike. The advice which I've had to go on for some time, I can aptly summarize as praise God and get a job. That's, yeah. And again, we can see the rhyming pattern, which I found to really help the sort of flow of the text and keep it engaging. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here's the second dialogue, which I've taken to calling Lusty Lewis and his failed quest for love. So this dialogue it's really a cautionary tale about falling in love with a stranger. And the author declares shortly after the end of it that the intention with this quote, which is, and not to love one before her manners though do know, but first know her, then love her, and so it will grow. And that's the end of the quote. And so clearly the protagonist falls in love with this beautiful woman, and he tries and fails several times to win her heart. Finally, in desperation and true sort of 1980s romantic comedy tradition, he writes and performs her a song on the harp. But I found the boombox on the right to be a bit more apt for a modern audience. And again, naturally, he fails miserably. And the song he has on the left, I'd be happy to read if we have time at the end, because it is something special. Next slide, please. So in terms of the actual encoding, I was very lucky that I managed to find a pre-existing transcription of the text from early English books online. I did find, however, that it, of course, as no transcription is, it wasn't perfect. There were quite a few errors and consistent sort of mistakes that I had to go through and correct, which I'm almost done with, still ongoing. But I found it served as a really good foundation for the encoding. And I was certainly glad of the assistance that it gave me for such a long text. And so in terms of the principles of my encoding, I was very new to both transcribing and encoding, so I tried to keep the texts as close to the original as I possibly could. You probably heard Will say just now diplomatic transcription, which is what I've got on the slide there, which is to keep it as close to the original. But there were some inherent challenges this brought, but I found some ways around it. So, next slide, please. So I initially really struggled with reading and comprehending the text, and I wanted to make it easier for a modern reader while still maintaining that diplomatic transcription. And I found the best way to do this actually was to group each part of the text into individual speakers. because of course it was a dialogue. This is what the author had intended, and I thought it would be easier to represent it in that manner. And so it just broke up the text into these sort of more digestible chunks. And at Henrike's suggestion, I'm actually going to go a step further and color code each sort of text, each dialogue, to make it that much easier. And as to the rhyming, which again, throughout the text, I made prominent usage out of the rhyming element, and I labeled each rhyme to sort of match each pair to make it a bit clearer where things are supposed to be rhyming, because of course, Middle English, it's not very easy to tell. And then the next slide, please. Yeah, here's the finished result. So some minor corrections, as I mentioned, but I'm very happy with how it's turned out, and yeah, I think it speaks for itself. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Over to Freya.
Hi. Yeah, good morning. So the pamphlet that I've been working on, can you hear me? Sorry, I just need to check. Good. So I've been working on ghostly psalms and spiritual songs. And so towards the end of our first week on this project in particular, we were given direction to browse the texts in the SAML band and select which one we would prefer to work on individually. And it was quite overwhelming because there are so many and they all vary considerably in length and language and content. And I just wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And yeah, and they're all quite distinct as what you can see from what everyone said before me. But having spent the first week transcribing and encoding the first folio of Ghostly Psalms to get a grip on TEI, I suppose that I developed a special sympathy for this pamphlet in particular. And I was drawn to it, like so many others before me. And if you click on the next slide, please, you can see this from the cracked down spine where everyone's opened it at the Ghostly Psalms pamphlet. So that was quite nice. And also, I guess the history of the text is quite interesting, that it is the only existing complete copy of the pamphlet, and it's held in Queen's College. And this is because in September 1546, it was included on the list of prohibited books, and as a result, most copies were destroyed, bar this one. And they were all burned at St. Paul's Cross outside St. Paul's Cathedral because it presents Lutheran theology, which is quite unpalatable at the time, I guess. And it's largely considered to be the first printed English hymn book, and it contains just over 40 hymns. And Miles Coverdale, who is perhaps more famous for translating the first printed English Bible, also translated many of the hymns in this book pamphlet from German in creating this pamphlet. So yeah, here is Miles Coverdale, and it was personally interesting for me to discover that he was also briefly Bishop of Exeter for 2 years, from 1551 to 1553, because I study at the University of Exeter and live quite locally. And there is a really dashing stained glass window portrait of him in the cathedral just above the entrance, which I think does him really good justice. Yeah, so next slide, please. Back to Ghostly Psalms, and how do I get from a physical object to a digital edition? And so, like the others have explained, the first thing to consider were the principles for the edition and the editorial choices that I would make regarding audience, function, and how this would influence my transcription of the text and what I would choose to include or omit. So next slide, please. Initially, I thought to transcribe the text hyper-diplomatically, which has been mentioned before, so this meant including all of the special characters that you can perhaps see in the facsimile on the left here, and yeah, all of the original orthography, and just basically represent it as close as possible to the original pamphlet. But my approach underwent a slight shift when I had an epiphany that this was not necessary, perhaps for my audience, which I concluded to be musicologists more than linguists, and so it was costing me some valuable time. And so I changed tact, and I dispensed with diacritical marks and expanded abbreviations like the thorns that Robbie explained earlier, and normalized spelling, so I changed U's and V's and I's and J's where it was applicable. And so now all that I had to really overcome was, to complete my transcription, was paleography, which in 16th century Gothic type isn't always the easiest to read, but we got there. And so next I took to encoding the transcription, and equipped with all of the skills that I'd learned in the first week, I got to work. And so encoding using TEI is a lot like, or just TEI, like acquiring it, is a lot like learning a new language, and you pick up vocabulary and like learning new tags. And there are many elements and attributes that you can employ to help represent the text in different ways. And so here you can, on this slide, you can see two things that I had to consider quite frequently were indented lines and marginalia. And so next slide, please. For indented lines, I use the rend indent attribute. And so this represented it indented. And for marginalia, most of it consisted of references to Bible scripture. So I used the note tag, which we learned in the first week, which I printed out here. So I put note type equals cloth and like the place where it appears. And next slide, please. Bible scripture in general was quite an unanticipated challenge for me because of the sheer volume of references in the pamphlet, but also formatting them in the TEI header was a bit tricky, because I chose to organize it by book, chapter, and verse, and this was quite laborious due to the sheer volume of references. But it was also, in doing it, it was really interesting to note which of the verses were most frequently cited, and unsurprisingly, there were a lot of Psalms. Yes, the next slide, please. So once I had encoded the text, it was time to take on the hymns, and I really, to begin with, I had no clue how I was going to get them into the XML document and then onto the website. And so it took quite a lot of research and just general consideration and picking brains to find a way to do this. And it was probably the biggest challenge that I had to overcome. But I came across MuseScore, which a music notation software, which I can see that the musicians from earlier are familiar with, which is nice. And yeah, but I didn't really know about it or how to use it. So I had to learn how to use the software to represent the notation. And then also regarding representing the notation, I had to translate from Mensura notation to more modern notation because I thought that was more useful for the audience that I was aiming at. Yeah, and so, yeah. And I also chose to halve the note values and use a treble clef as opposed to a C clef, which is featured in the pamphlet. And then from once I had the notation, so I've done the first line of the first hymn here, which you can see. I exported it as a PNG document, which I could then screenshot each line as another individual PNG and insert it into the XML. And so next slide, please. So with the help of Seb particularly, we found the notated music tag, which nested within it, you could use a graphic tag, and where I could link the URL images, which really nicely integrated the pictures into the coding. And yeah, so I'm continuing to encode the hymns because there's quite a lot of them, but I've done a few, and I'm looking forward to getting them all done. And it looks really great on the Taylor Editions website. I'm really happy with it. And yeah, I think there's one more slide just to represent my trials and tribulations. So yeah, thank you.
Many thanks, Freya. And we would have loved really to have you all round for this final conference in Queen's College Chapel to sing the Coverdale hymns from the original volume. And we have the promise that this will be possible in November. So this is also an invitation to all the others on the Humanities and Social Sciences projects to join us in November for live performance. To finish our presentation, we thought we would just give you a bit of a sound bite. We had prepared 3 hymns. We'll reduce it to 1. The first we had thought we would cover was one of the hymns calling for inspiration, since I thought that's always helpful to have. The second hymn we had considered doing is one by Cistercian nun who left the convent and went over to the Protestant side, but took her mystical theology with her, Elisabeth Krutziger. Christ is the only Son of God, a very interesting context. But we'll finish now just with the first verse of what Heinrich Heine called the Marseillaise of the Reformation, which is Martin Luther's freely adapted translation of Psalm 45, Deus Noster Refugium, and we'll try to do it as a congregational hymn. And everybody welcome to sing along muted. Our God is a defense and tower, a good armor and good weapon. He has been ever our help and succor in all the troubles that we have been in. Therefore will we never dread for any wanderer's steed, by water or by land, in hills or the sea's end. Oh, God has them all in his hand. Thank you.